Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of Cleveland. Before we begin, please write in the comments below where you're listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. In the winter of 1950, a medical researcher named Thomas Harrington disappeared from Cleveland General Hospital without a trace. According to hospital records, Dr. Harrington had been conducting what he called dream analysis sessions with terminal patients in the palliative care ward for nearly 7 months. The hospital administration claimed his departure was due to funding cuts and personal reasons, but several nurses who worked closely with him told a different story to anyone who would listen. Those nurses were later transferred to different hospitals across 3 different states within 6 months of Harrington's disappearance. What made this case particularly unsettling wasn't just the sudden vanishing of a respected neurologist, but the discovery made by a janitor 3 weeks after Harrington was last seen. In a storage closet that had been converted into a makeshift research space, the janitor found dozens of unlabeled wax cylinders stacked neatly in wooden boxes, alongside a modified Edison phonograph with unusual attachments. The device had wires that connected to what appeared to be medical electrodes. When the hospital director listened to one of the cylinders, he immediately ordered all materials destroyed, and the incident struck from all records. But not everything was destroyed. The Harrington case might have been forgotten entirely if not for the discovery made in 1967 by Elaine Winters, a doctoral student researching the history of dream theory at Case Western Reserve University. While examining archived medical journals, Winters found references to Harrington's research, including photographs of what he called the oniric frequency recorder. The machine looked like a standard medical electroencephalogram of the era, but with several unusual modifications, including a recording apparatus that appeared to be connected to a phonograph. What's more disturbing is what Harrington claimed the machine could do. According to his sparse notes, the device could somehow capture and record the dream content of patients in their final hours of life. Winters attempted to locate Harrington for an interview, but her inquiries led nowhere. After 3 months of persistent research, she abruptly abandoned her dissertation. Her academic advisor received a brief letter stating she was leaving academia for personal reasons. No one in her department ever heard from her again. Long before Thomas Harrington began his controversial experiments, he led a quiet life in Shaker Heights, one of Cleveland's more prestigious neighborhoods. Neighbors described the Harrington family as private but cordial. Thomas and his wife Margaret had moved to the area in 1943 with their young son, William. They were the kind of family that blended into the social fabric without drawing attention. Thomas was known as a serious but pleasant man who left early each morning and often returned late in the evening. Margaret managed the household and participated in community activities just enough to avoid seeming antisocial. William attended the local school and was described by teachers as unusually bright but somewhat withdrawn. The family attended church services at St. Dominic's every Sunday, sitting in the same pew near the back, arriving exactly 7 minutes before the service began and leaving immediately after it ended. The Harringtons never hosted dinner parties or social gatherings at their home. Invitations extended to them were politely declined, with references to Thomas's demanding work schedule. The family had no pets, maintained a tidy but unexceptional garden, and their home showed no signs of personal expression visible from the street. To casual observers, the Harringtons were simply another successful professional family living the American dream in post-war Ohio. What neighbors couldn't have known was that Thomas Harrington's interest in dreams began long before his medical career. According to a journal found in his office desk at the hospital, Harrington had been fascinated by dreams since childhood, particularly those that occurred in the moments before death. The journal entry from October 12, 1947, referenced an incident from his childhood when he was present at his grandmother's passing. He wrote that she had spoken lucidly about seeing people and places from her youth in vivid detail just minutes before her heart stopped. This experience haunted him, and he wondered if these weren't hallucinations, but rather something more significant. Perhaps the mind, accessing deeper layers of consciousness as it prepared to shut down. The journal also contained references to experiments he conducted privately, long before the hospital officially sanctioned his research. These early entries described crude attempts to record his own dreams using a modified dictation machine activated by changes in his breathing patterns. These experiments yielded limited results, but his notes suggest he remained convinced that dreams could be externalized and captured somehow. The final pages of the journal, dated just 2 weeks before his disappearance, contained increasingly erratic writing about breakthrough moments and voices crossing the threshold. The last entry simply stated, "It works. God help me, it actually works." The first indication that something had changed at Cleveland General Hospital came in early 1949 when Dr. Harrington requested a private research space for what he called a sleep study focused on terminal patients. According to hospital memos obtained decades later through a Freedom of Information Act request, the hospital administration initially denied his request. However, after Harrington secured private funding from an unnamed benefactor, the administration reversed their decision. A former supply closet on the 3rd floor was converted into a small research lab, and Harrington was granted permission to invite terminal patients to participate in his study. The official documentation described the research as an analysis of sleep patterns in patients with terminal diagnoses to determine if sleep quality could be improved in their final days. Nothing in the approved research protocol mentioned recording dreams or the use of experimental equipment. Nurse Catherine Donovan, who assisted Harrington during the early phases of his research, later reported that the initial sessions were straightforward. Electrodes were attached to patients' temples to monitor brain activity during sleep, and Harrington simply observed and took notes. It wasn't until April of 1949 that things began to change. Harrington became increasingly secretive, often conducting sessions alone and keeping his notes separate from official hospital records. When questioned by hospital administrators, he would provide vague reports emphasizing improved sleep quality among participants, while omitting any mention of the machine he was developing in his private workshop at home. Meanwhile, in the Harrington household, tensions were mounting. Margaret Harrington later confided to her sister in letters discovered after her death that Thomas had become increasingly distant and preoccupied. He converted their basement into a workshop where he spent most evenings and weekends tinkering with electronic equipment. Strange packages would arrive at the house, containing vacuum tubes, electrical components, and medical supplies that Thomas refused to explain. Their son William, now 12 years old, began to avoid the basement entirely, claiming he heard strange sounds coming from behind the locked door. Margaret wrote that on several occasions she woke in the middle of the night to find Thomas's side of the bed empty. When she ventured downstairs, she could hear him talking to himself in the basement, his voice alternating between excited whispers and prolonged silences. When confronted, Thomas would dismiss her concerns, insisting his work was too important to wait and too complicated to explain. By Christmas of 1949, Margaret described their marriage as a house with all the lights turned off. She noted that William had started having nightmares, often waking up screaming about the machine that steals thoughts. Thomas showed little concern for his son's distress, suggesting instead that William might be an interesting subject for his research once the device was perfected. This suggestion led to the first serious argument the couple had in years, ending with Thomas sleeping in his workshop for 3 consecutive nights. According to statements from hospital orderly James Mitchell, The first test of what came to be known as the oniric frequency recorder took place on January 8, 1950. The subject was a 67-year-old woman named Eleanor Pruitt, who was in the final stages of lung cancer. Mitchell assisted in transporting Mrs. Pruitt to Harrington's research room, noting that the doctor seemed unusually agitated, checking and rechecking his equipment before allowing the patient to be brought in. The session was scheduled to last 2 hours, but after just 45 minutes, Mitchell was summoned back to the room by an urgent call. He found Mrs. Pruitt in a state of extreme distress, her body rigid and her eyes wide open, though she appeared unconscious. Harrington was frantically adjusting dials on his machine while a wax cylinder spun, recording sounds that Mitchell would later describe as neither human nor mechanical, but something in between, like voices underwater trying to form words. Mrs. Pruitt died 17 minutes later, still connected to the machine. Harrington insisted that her death was an unfortunate coincidence and had nothing to do with his experiment. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to advanced carcinoma. Mitchell reported the incident to his supervisor, but no formal investigation followed. Harrington was allowed to continue his research, though Mitchell requested to be reassigned to a different floor. His request was granted the following day, and he was instructed not to discuss the incident with anyone. 2 days later, Harrington requested a new assistant. Nurse Rebecca Collins was assigned to the position. The relationship between Dr. Thomas Harrington and Nurse Rebecca Collins evolved quickly from professional to something more complex. According to Collins' personal diary, recovered from her apartment after her own disappearance in April of 1950, she was initially impressed by Harrington's dedication to his patients. She wrote that he seemed genuinely concerned with providing comfort to the dying, spending hours talking with them about their lives, their regrets, and their dreams. The diary entries from late January describe how Harrington gradually included Collins in more aspects of his research, explaining the purpose of his machine and the modifications he continued to make. He told her that conventional science had been too limited in its understanding of consciousness, particularly at the moment of death. He believed that dreams weren't just random neural firings, but glimpses into other states of existence. Collins wrote that she found his theories fascinating, if unorthodox. By February, the nature of their relationship had changed. Collins's diary entries became more personal, referring to Thomas by his first name and mentioning late nights spent discussing his theories over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. She described feeling like she was part of something revolutionary and that Thomas trusted her in ways he couldn't trust others, not even his wife. The final entries in Collins' diary detail changes in Harrington's behavior following what she called the breakthrough. She wrote that after a session with a patient named Howard Walters on March 12th, Thomas had emerged from the research room looking simultaneously elated and terrified. He played a portion of the recording for her, though she didn't describe what she heard. She only wrote that afterward, Thomas became obsessed with refining the recording process, often working through the night without sleep. The Walters recording marked a turning point in Harrington's research. Hospital records show that following the session with Howard Walters, Harrington requested access to more terminal patients, particularly those who were still lucid but expected to die within days. His requests raised concerns among some staff members who began to question the ethical implications of his work. Dr. Richard Bennett, head of oncology, noted in a memo to the hospital director that Harrington's patients often appeared exhausted after their sessions, and some reported disturbing dreams in the nights following their participation in his study. Bennett suggested a formal review of Harrington's methods, but the hospital director responded that as long as patients provided consent and no direct harm was observed, the research could continue. What no one knew at the time was that Harrington had begun conducting unsanctioned sessions during the night shift when supervision was minimal. Orderly Frank Perez, who worked nights, later testified to hospital administrators that he had seen Harrington with patients who weren't officially part of his study. According to Perez, these nighttime sessions were longer, sometimes lasting until dawn, and patients were often returned to their rooms in states of extreme fatigue or disorientation. Some were unable to speak for hours afterward, while others reported no memory of the session at all. Perez's concerns were dismissed as the hospital administration believed the patient's symptoms were simply progression of their illnesses. Meanwhile, the collection of wax cylinders in Harrington's research room continued to grow. From the perspective of those who knew nothing about Harrington's work, the spring of 1950 in Cleveland continued like any other. The city was enjoying post-war prosperity, with new housing developments expanding into the suburbs and industries booming. At Cleveland General Hospital, the daily routines of medical care continued without interruption. Patients were admitted, treated, and discharged, while others arrived at their final destination in the hospital morgue. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss in the third-floor research room where Dr. Harrington continued his work. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, something had begun to fracture. Margaret Harrington later reported that by early April, Thomas had essentially stopped coming home. He called occasionally to say he was staying at the hospital to monitor patients, but when she called the hospital looking for him, he was often not where he claimed to be. William's nightmares had worsened to the point that he was now sleeping in his mother's room. The boy refused to discuss the content of his dreams, but he would wake up screaming about the voices in the black box and the people who aren't dead but can't leave. Margaret considered taking William to a psychiatrist, but feared what he might say about his father's work. Meanwhile, at the hospital, staff began to notice strange occurrences on the third floor. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Lights would flicker when Harrington's machine was operating. Most disturbing were the reports from patients in rooms adjacent to Harrington's research space, who complained of hearing voices through the walls. Voices that didn't belong to anyone on the hospital staff. When maintenance workers investigated, they found nothing unusual about the wall structure or ventilation system that could explain the phenomenon. On the morning of April 23, 1950, nurse Rebecca Collins did not report for her shift. When the hospital called her apartment, there was no answer. Later that day, Dr. Thomas Harrington also failed to appear for scheduled appointments. The hospital administration assumed the two absences were connected, given rumors of their close working relationship. A formal complaint was filed with the personnel department, and both Collins and Harrington were marked for termination due to abandonment of duties. 3 days later, Margaret Harrington contacted the police to report her husband missing. The detective assigned to the case, Frank Kowalski, conducted a cursory investigation, concluding that Harrington had likely run off with his nurse. This explanation satisfied hospital administrators who were already working to distance themselves from Harrington's unorthodox research methods. Margaret refused to accept this explanation, insisting that something more sinister had occurred. She demanded that investigators examine Thomas's research room and their home basement workshop. When Detective Kowalski finally agreed to inspect the hospital research room on May 2nd, he found it had been completely cleared out. No equipment remained, and the file cabinets contained only standard hospital forms. The administration claimed that after Harrington's termination, his research materials had been boxed up and sent to his home address, a shipment Margaret insisted never arrived. When Kowalski examined the Harrington basement, he found it similarly empty, with only mounting brackets on the walls, and electrical outlets suggesting it had once housed substantial equipment. The detective's report concluded that Harrington had planned his disappearance carefully, removing all evidence of his work. The case was classified as a voluntary disappearance, and no further investigation was pursued by Cleveland police. What happened in the final days before Thomas Harrington and Rebecca Collins vanished remained a mystery for almost 2 decades. Then, in 1968, a remarkable document surfaced. During renovations of the third floor of Cleveland General Hospital, construction workers discovered a sealed envelope taped to the inside of an air duct in what had once been Harrington's research room. The envelope contained 15 pages of handwritten notes by Rebecca Collins, dated April 21st and 22nd, 1950, just before her disappearance. The hospital administration initially suppressed these documents, but a conscientious administrator made photocopies before surrendering the originals to hospital legal counsel. These photocopies eventually reached a journalist named Michael Brennan, who published portions of them in an article for the Cleveland Plain Dealer in 1970. According to Collins's notes, by mid-April, Harrington had become convinced that his machine was doing far more than simply recording dreams. He believed it was capturing what he called transition states, the consciousness of patients as they moved between life and death. Collins wrote that Harrington had modified his equipment to operate at specific frequencies that he claimed could stimulate these transition states even in patients who weren't actively dying. The notes described how Harrington had begun using the machine on himself, connecting the electrodes to his own temples while listening to previous recordings through specially designed headphones. After these self-experiments, he would remain in trance-like states for hours, mumbling about the voices on the other side and the waiting place. Most disturbing was Collins's description of what happened during their final recording session with a patient named Samuel Green on April 22nd. According to her notes, when the machine was activated, Green began speaking in voices that weren't his own, voices that Collins recognized as belonging to previous patients who had died while connected to the machine. Harrington was ecstatic, declaring that he had proven his theory that consciousness persisted after death and could be captured and transmitted through his device. The final page of Collins' notes expressed her fear that Harrington had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and that she planned to destroy the machine before it could be used again. The notes ended abruptly in mid-sentence. Following the publication of Michael Brennan's article, public interest in the Harrington case surged briefly. Several former hospital employees came forward with additional information, including janitor Harold Wilson, who claimed to have helped Harrington move equipment from the hospital to a rental van late on the night of April 22nd, 1950. Wilson recalled that Harrington seemed agitated and kept checking over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Nurse Collins was with him, looking pale and withdrawn. Wilson noted that among the items loaded into the van were dozens of wax cylinder recordings, carefully packed in wooden crates, and a large machine covered with a canvas tarp. When Wilson asked where they were taking everything, Harrington replied cryptically, "Somewhere quiet where we can hear them clearly." The janitor also remembered seeing unusual marks on Harrington's temples, small circular abrasions that matched the electrode placements used in his research. Despite this new information, no official investigation was reopened. The Harrington family had moved away from Cleveland years earlier, and hospital administrators were reluctant to revisit a case that could potentially damage their reputation. Michael Brennan continued to investigate independently, tracking down former patients who had participated in Harrington's studies. Most had died in the intervening years, but family members recalled their loved ones describing strange experiences, vivid dreams of conversations with the deceased, sensations of being in multiple places simultaneously, and in some cases, voices that continued to speak to them long after the sessions ended. Brennan compiled these accounts into a book manuscript titled The Dream Collector, but no publisher would touch it. His research notes were donated to the Cleveland Public Library archives after his death in 1976, where they remained largely forgotten. In the summer of 1969, a significant development occurred when construction workers demolishing an abandoned warehouse in East Cleveland discovered a hidden room in the basement. Inside was what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory containing electronic equipment in various states of disassembly. Among the items recovered was a modified phonograph with unusual attachments and 3 intact wax cylinders. The property records showed that the warehouse had been rented under the name Robert Collins from May 1950 until December 1951, when the rent payment stopped. Police investigated the discovery but quickly closed the case, considering it nothing more than abandoned equipment from a bygone era. The items were logged into evidence and eventually stored in the Cleveland Police Department's evidence warehouse. There they might have remained indefinitely, if not for Detective James Harker, who joined the Cold Case Unit in 1977 and developed an interest in the Harrington disappearance after reading Brennan's archived research. Harker located the evidence from the warehouse and arranged for the wax cylinders to be played. What he heard defied explanation. The recordings contained what sounded like multiple voices speaking simultaneously, some clearly, others distant and distorted. More disturbing were the moments of silence, punctuated by what Harker described as the sound of breathing that wasn't human. According to Harker's notes, one voice repeated the same phrase several times. "He's listening to us now. He's always listening." Harker attempted to enhance the recordings using the audio technology available at the time, but the results were inconclusive. His request for further investigation was denied by his superiors, who cited budget constraints and lack of evidence of any actual crime. Frustrated, Harker continued his investigation unofficially during his off-duty hours. He managed to track down William Harrington, Thomas's son, who was now living in California under a different last name. William refused to speak with Harker directly, but sent a brief letter stating only, "Some doors should remain closed. For your own sake, stop looking." Harker was found dead in his apartment 3 weeks later, officially ruled a suicide. Decades passed, and the Harrington case faded from public memory, becoming little more than an urban legend among Cleveland hospital staff. Then, in August of 2003, a graduate student named David Chen discovered a set of patient records while researching the history of palliative care for his doctoral dissertation. The records, which had been misfiled in the hospital archives, contained detailed notes on 8 patients who participated in Harrington's sleep studies between January and April 1950. What made these records remarkable was that they included transcriptions of patient interviews conducted after their sessions with the oniric frequency recorder. The patients described remarkably similar experiences: a sensation of floating above their bodies, encounters with deceased loved ones who spoke to them with increasing clarity as the sessions progressed, and awareness of conversations occurring in other parts of the hospital that they couldn't possibly have overheard. Most significantly, several patients reported hearing the same voice, described as neither male nor female, but somehow both, speaking through the machine. This voice allegedly told them that death is not an ending, but a transition, and that consciousness can be captured and preserved. The final patient interview, conducted with Samuel Green on April 21st, contained a disturbing account. Green claimed that during his session he could hear the voices of previous patients calling to him through the machine. He said these voices were asking for help, saying they couldn't move on because something was holding them in place. Green became so distressed during the interview that the hospital staff terminated it prematurely. He died the following morning, with the cause of death listed as heart failure due to advanced carcinoma. Chen published his findings in an obscure academic journal, where they attracted little attention outside of paranormal research circles. When contacted by interested researchers, Chen revealed that he had attempted to locate the original recordings mentioned in the patient files, but was told by hospital administrators that no such recordings existed in their archives. The most recent chapter in the Harrington mystery began in 2010, when a storage unit in Lakewood, Ohio, was auctioned off after rent payments ceased following the death of its elderly owner. The buyer, a vintage electronics collector named Paul Reston, discovered among the contents a locked metal case. When he managed to open it, he found 6 wax cylinders carefully packed in protective material, along with a handwritten journal. The journal belonged to Rebecca Collins and contained entries from April 23, 1950 through December 12, 1951. According to these entries, Collins had not disappeared with Thomas Harrington, as commonly believed. Instead, she had fled with the recordings and key components of the machine after witnessing what she described as a catastrophic breach. Her final session with Harrington and patient Samuel Green had convinced her that the machine wasn't simply recording dreams or capturing consciousness. It was creating a bridge between life and death, a bridge that allowed traffic in both directions. Collins wrote that something had come through during that session, something that had taken residence in Thomas Harrington. She described how his personality changed instantly, how his voice took on unfamiliar cadences, and how he spoke of himself in the plural. Terrified, Collins had drugged Harrington's coffee, and while he was unconscious, dismantled the machine and escaped with what she believed were its most crucial components. She spent the next 19 months hiding in the East Cleveland warehouse, attempting to understand the technology Harrington had created and trying to determine what to do with the recordings. Her final entry stated her intention to destroy everything, concluding that some knowledge isn't meant for us. Whether she succeeded in destroying the machine remains unknown. Paul Reston, unaware of the significance of his find, attempted to play one of the wax cylinders on an antique phonograph. The machine malfunctioned after just 30 seconds of playback, producing what Reston described as a sound like static, but with voices buried in it. Reston posted about his find on an online forum dedicated to vintage audio, including a short clip of what he'd managed to record before the malfunction. The post attracted the attention of paranormal researchers, but before any professional analysis could be conducted, Reston's home was burglarized. The cylinders, Collins' journal, and Reston's recording equipment were the only items taken. The Cleveland police investigated, but found no suspects. Reston reported receiving strange phone calls in the weeks following the burglary, calls where no one spoke, but he could hear what sounded like multiple people breathing. These calls stopped abruptly after 3 weeks. Reston moved out of Ohio shortly thereafter and has declined all requests for interviews. The whereabouts of Thomas Harrington remain unknown to this day. No death certificate has ever been filed, nor has there been any confirmed sighting since April 22, 1950. His son William died in 1992 without ever publicly discussing his father's work or disappearance. Margaret Harrington remarried in 1955 and lived quietly until her death in 1988. According to her second husband, she refused to speak of Thomas, except to say that he went somewhere he couldn't return from. Rebecca Collins likewise vanished completely after abandoning the East Cleveland warehouse. No official record of her exists after 1951. No death certificate, no social security activity, no property records. It's as if both Harrington and Collins were simply erased from the world. The machine they built, with its ability to supposedly record the dreams of the dying, has never been fully reconstructed, though rumors periodically surface about similar devices being developed in private research facilities. The original wax cylinder recordings remain unaccounted for, with the exception of the 3 found in the abandoned warehouse and the 6 discovered in Collins's storage unit, all of which have subsequently disappeared. What actually happened at Cleveland General Hospital in the spring of 1950 may never be fully understood. Was Thomas Harrington a misunderstood genius whose experiments ventured into territory science wasn't ready to explore? Was he a disturbed individual whose delusions infected those around him? Or did he actually succeed in creating a device that could breach the barrier between life and death? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is suggested in the final paragraph of Rebecca Collins's journal. I no longer believe Thomas created a machine to record the dreams of the dying. I believe something on the other side had been trying to create a way in, and it found Thomas, a man so desperate to understand death that he would open any door, no matter what might be waiting on the other side. The machine isn't a recorder, it's a gateway, and I fear it's still open. Some say that if you visit the third floor of what was once Cleveland General Hospital, now renovated into upscale medical offices, you can sometimes hear strange sounds coming from the walls, sounds that resemble the scratchy quality of an old phonograph recording. Maintenance workers report unexplained electrical disturbances, particularly at night, and patients occasionally mention hearing voices when no one is present. Most of these accounts are dismissed as urban legends or the natural sounds of an aging building. Yet the question remains, if consciousness can indeed be captured, where does it go? And what happens when the medium containing it deteriorates or is destroyed? Do the voices fade away, or do they find other ways to be heard? The answers, like Thomas Harrington and his machine, remain elusive, perhaps intentionally so. For as Rebecca Collins wrote in her final journal entry, there are truths that should remain hidden, not because we aren't ready for them, but because they aren't ready for us. The last known person to actively investigate the Harrington case was journalist Mark Stevens, who in 2015 attempted to track down the missing wax cylinders. After 6 months of research, Stevens abruptly abandoned the project. When asked why by colleagues, he would only say, "I started hearing voices on my digital recorder, voices I recognized but couldn't possibly be hearing." Stevens left journalism shortly after and now reportedly lives somewhere in rural Maine, where neighbors say he refuses to have any electronic recording devices in his home. He doesn't own a phone,